Hello, everybody. My name is Stephanie Shalana Brown, and I am the director of the Division of Virgin Islands Cultural Education within our larger Virgin Islands Department of Education. With me today, I have the Honorable Chenzira Davis Kahina, who is the director of the Virgin Islands Caribbean Cultural Center. And the Caribbean Cultural Center's mission with the University of the Virgin Islands under the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, they work collaboratively to serve as a liaison to create a reservoir of resources and initiatives for faculty, students, administration, staff, and the broader community. And this is to maintain and sustain access to materials that nurture, preserve, research, document, restore, promote, and protect and respect the Virgin Islands and the wider Caribbean. Today, we are going to be highlighting and observing the Honorable Reverend Edward Wilmot Blyden. He was an educator, writer, diplomat, and politician, primarily in Africa, and he is beloved in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and he's also regarded as the father of Pan Africanism. His work has inspired W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and George Padmore. So let us welcome Dr. Chenzira Davis Kahina as we have an observation on the Honorable Reverend Edward Blyden. Oh, and I meant to note that he is also born in the Danish West Indies, specifically to St. Thomas. So we honor all our ancestors and give major reverence. Dr. Kahina?
It is wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to celebrate, commemorate, and give that honorific reverence to the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. May his memory, his achievements, his contributions to the world continue to be respected, replicated, duplicated, and honored for generations upon generations. I am very excited because August 3rd is really important. You know, August 3rd represents that day when the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden was born, 1832, as you shared, on St. Thomas. And I need to highlight, as a free person of African ancestry, of free parents of the Igbo ethnic nation, it's really important that we navigate that he was a second generation of Africans coming from the continent, bringing forth their skills, talents, and expertise at a time when the enslavement institutions were still in process. While there was a lot of activity for emancipation, transpiring in the neighboring British Isles, which shifted in 1834 to 1838, it wasn't until 1848 that the Virgin Islands, then the Danish West Indies, formally freed, at least on paper, the Africans that were subjected to chattel enslavement and a host of other colonial processes, yeah? Part of what I'd like to start with when we talk about and have a discussion on the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden is how well-renowned his work continues to be, given reverence and respect literally throughout Africa, throughout Eurasia, throughout North and South America, the Caribbean, Central America, the world. And it's very important that we add him and hold him up high as one of our historic, eloquent, diplomatic, exceptional, extraordinary icons here in the Virgin Islands of the US. So I'll start with a quote that kind of gives some centering, and then I will share some references based on what I shared with you a little earlier on having a wonderful morning conversation, obviously to prepare me for today, with one of his great granddaughters. So I'll start with this particular quote from Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. "There is a talent entrusted to you. It is your duty to call into action the highest forms of your being. It does not matter what your calling may be, whether it be what men call menial or what the world calls honorable, whether it be to speak in the halls of Congress or to sweep out those halls, whether it be to wait upon others or to be waited on. It is the manner of using your faculties that will determine the results, that will determine your true influence in this world and your status in the world to come. Everyone should do his part to advance humanity. Each should exert himself to be a helper in progress. Whatever your condition, you do occupy some room in the world. What are you doing to make return for the room you occupy? There are so many of our people who fail to realize their responsibility, who fail to hear the inspiring call of the past and the prophetic call of the future." Closing those quotes. And that's from the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden in 1908. And keeping in mind that as he was moving, into eldership, and he was doing so many, this is after he had the honor and privilege of becoming the president of Liberia College, after teaching there in a variety of areas, particularly around Greek and Latin languages and other classical languages, classic Western languages. He was also proficient in more than a dozen other languages, inclusive of multiple languages in the continent, West, Central, North, East, and South. And that also added to his ability to be very engaging as an international diplomat, as a statesperson, as an ambassador, as a representative to the precursor of what we now know as the Department of Interior, with engagement with the US as well as with engagement with countries, particularly in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where his groundings, his home is. People to this day will say that he's from Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, there are edifices, various institutions named after him, roads, streets, etc. He is considered an illustrious icon in those countries. And equitably, we should continue to hold him up here in the Virgin Islands.
You mentioned that he was growing up as a free person, and this is before emancipation occurred in 1848. But we know, even though he was a free person, he may have experienced in social injustices. Can you tell us about his early studies and his work out or ideals and beliefs in the Christian church?
So there's a lot that can be said about the Honorable Edward Wilmot Blyden. And I would be remiss to not encourage persons to look at any of the research, particularly by those historians that have expertise on studying his early life, his midlife engagements, his work in terms of eldership, and even the transformation he experienced I won't say coming out of the Christian church, but questioning the very essence and the very foundational doctrines of Christianity, coming through the Dutch Reformed Church and other elements of Christianity. In his youth, he was considered a prodigy. His ability to reason, to engage in intellectual discourse, his speaking skills were not just speaking skills. He had strengthened his skills to the level of being like an orator, an exceptional orator, and an exceptional elocutionist. And of course, in his ministry, that was also another portion, that in his youth, many of his talents were identified by persons that were surrounding the Protestant doctrines. He was influenced by what was going on around the American Colonization Society with that whole movement of taking free people of color, Africans, out of the US and establishing these resettlements in Liberia. And that also progressed into places like Sierra Leone and other parts of West Africa. What is really,
can you note for, because I think a lot of our students and community members, some may and some may not, if you could just explain what is Freetown and what is Sierra Leone and what does it mean to the persons of the African diaspora?
Liberia is a country in West Africa. And what I like to do, if it's possible, and I will encourage persons to, this is where the mapping piece becomes important, because that way people can place where these countries are in West Africa. And it's important that we look at some of these spaces so that when we're having this conversation about the illustrious, honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, you can place, he came from very humble beginnings as a free African out of St. Thomas, was given opportunities because of his exceptional intellectual skills as a young person to move forward in theological studies. It was always part of his destiny to be a member of the clergy. And what was amusing in many persons' understandings of him is that there was a period of time, okay, he was born in 1832, but between 1840s and mid 40s, early 40s to mid 40s, his family also lived in Venezuela. And so he became fluent in Spanish. And persons overlooked that, they were educators, they were also involved in the church. There's work that has been documented by the honorable scholar, Dr. Hollis R. Lynch, that showed how between that period when they returned from Venezuela, that the Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden was exposed and seen by a Reverend John Knox, who was a pastor in the St. Thomas Protestant Dutch Reformed Church. And seeing the studiousness, the skills, talents, and expertise, and again, like I said, he was a serious intellectual as a young person, Knox became one of his mentors. During that time, in that training, the recommendation was made on or about the late 1840s, coming into the early 1850s, for Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden to consider being enrolled. And there was a recommendation made for him to go to the Rutgers Theological College. I remember 1850s, America.
But we just got our emancipation in 1848, right?
Exactly. So there were a lot of different dynamics. And while that emancipation was gained or not gained, demanded and taken by the former enslaved Africans in what was then the Danish West Indies, there was also these conversations of shifting ownership of the Danish West Indies to the US. So that was also in the background of where is this youth coming, feeling that he can be in a theological seminary with whites. So needless to say, that did not go well. He was refused admission based on his race as being an African. And it just created, again, another opportunity that he could have returned to the Virgin Islands and engaged in what was a lot of engagement around that time, because there was a lot of activism. There was more labor engagements happening following the emancipation of Africans in the Danish West Indies. And he was given an opportunity at that time to go, and he was encouraged also by Reverend Knox to accept the opportunity to work with the American Colonization Society and other groups that were about abolition of enslavement, et cetera. Because again, remember, this is on the eve a good 50, almost 13 years, 13 to 15 years before the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. So there was a lot going on. There were a lot of dynamics. And so it was a great opportunity for the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden to go to Liberia and to be in a West African country in its early formations of establishing self-determination, sovereignty, listen to the words that I'm using: independence, freedom, liberty, justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for African people in the continent, working alongside brothers and sisters of African ancestry coming out of the diaspora. In this case, the Americas. And when I say Americas, I mean not the 48 contiguous, because I'll say that. I'm speaking from the North Pole to the South Pole, the Americas, right? Because persons were coming from the Caribbean, Central America, South America, North America, Canada, etc., and all the different little isles in between, outside, Pacific side, Atlantic side, etc. So there's a lot that comes with that. And I'm hoping, for the purposes of those that are listening, it's important to navigate and look at maps of the African continent. You need to see what 12 million square miles looks like to recognize the depth and the expansion, the multiplicity of ethnic nations and groups, not just complexion, and the hundreds of languages that take up that space. And Liberia has a very special tie to the US, to Africans coming out of the US, because that was one of the primary spaces in the mid 1800s that was utilized as a resettlement space for Africans coming out of the Americas, returning to the African continent. And of course, it spread into other spaces, Sierra Leone. There were other engagements in Ghana and what is now Togo and what is now Benin, and that whole region. I'm able to share my screen, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. So if you may have another question, that'll give me an opportunity. I like using maps because that way persons can.
And I guess that's one of the things that Marcus Garvey felt close to him and his works, because Marcus Garvey believed that people of the African diaspora should repatriate back to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that in his works, but also in his works, I found it must have been hard for him to be a person of color and also be a person who upholds Christian beliefs, because even as a believer of the Christian ideologies and religion, some of those same persons who uphold those beliefs that he would be looking to for guidance would also show injustices to him and be very un-Christian-like. And I wondered how he handled race and religion.
It's interesting that you put it in that context, because that's why I always encourage persons. I love how you put me on the spot. This is fabulous. His work, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro race, should be read by anyone, across races, ethnic groups, to just get an understanding, a deeper awareness of his intellectual strengths and his perspectives on Christianity, Islam, which are two of the major Western religions. And there's a reference inside of his work to Judaism. So when we speak of the three major Western religions, he references all three. But he spends a particular amount of time on Christianity and Islam, and then shows that connection to answer some of the questions that you raised so eloquently. The impact on the Negro race, keeping in mind that that was the term, because it was Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid in terms of anthropological references, and people use Negro in the 1800s like how people tend to use Black or African American now. And for the purposes of my discourse with you. And, I'm very honored to have the opportunity to share this with your listeners and your viewers, and especially our students. You need to know as much as possible about the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. I'm saying it watch my eyes carefully, because he was one of the most forward-thinking, not just a scholar, not just a man of the cloth, clergy, reverend, not just a intellectual doctor, not only a statesman and an ambassador. He was human. And it's really important to look and see how he was able to envelope all this change and transformation. Just imagine, it's enslavement when you're born, but you're free. When you walk through the streets of Main Street, St. Thomas, some people that look like you are not allowed to have the same rights as you. And you have certain privileges. And then it changes. You leave, you go to another country, Venezuela, you come back, you're speaking another language, expressing yourself a little differently. But it's still, even though there's quote unquote emancipation and a certain amount of freeness, there's still inequities in labor. And you come from a privileged family that can travel to this country and do this work in the ministry and so forth. So just imagine what he was going through. I mean, and we can speak to that only through inference. It's important to look at his own work. Some of the work he wrote on African life and customs. It's another publication that these are some works to understand what he saw, how he lived, what his perspectives were as he was living through these experiences, and how he was able to tie that through the lens of his role as a Christian, and how he studied Islam thoroughly and understood the synergy between Christianity and Islam and the impact that it had on people of African ancestry, whether they were born, bred, fungi-fed in the Virgin Islands, or if they were born and bred in the continent of Africa. And I do have a couple quotes, but I'd like for you to share any other questions first.
The questions is how do you see, because what we want to do is perpetuate some of the honorable things that he did and have his work live on. How do our students, and you kind of touch base on it, how do our students and our community members engage in a stronger identity as people? And it doesn't necessarily have to be African, because I think whenever you have a stronger sense of self, you're able to impact the world more positively. So how do we gain a stronger sense of ourselves through his work to then go into the community and the larger global community and be impactful?
Well, I am going to use a couple of references. There's some websites like BlackPast, BlackPast.org, that provides general information. And that way you can go to their search engine on BlackPast.org and find specific pieces about Edward Wilmot Blyden, as well as other people that have contributed to African life, humanity, all of that. Another resource that is very helpful also, and a tad more progressive, and it will speak to the work of Blyden, what they reference as a voice from Bleeding Africa, and that is on Kentake, Kentake page, PAGE.com. Again, KENTAKE.com. That's another website that provides a lot of good, well-referenced historical information that you can use that is research worthy. Yeah. There's another piece that I was referencing as I was listening to your question, and this particular one is from an actual address. Some of the sermons, some of the speeches that were shared by the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. This particular one was during a time, it was a series that he did in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Maryland. Those are the areas I'm remembering. And this was like in the 1860s. The Call of Providence to the Descendants of Africa in America, a discourse delivered to colored congregations in the cities of New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Harrisburg during the summer of 1862. And I share that because those are the types of sermons and speeches that very similarly, the style that Edward Wilmot Blyden established was something that was followed through by persons like Rothschild Francis, persons like Caspar Holstein, who we know as Egbert Joseph Holstein, the persons like Marcus Garvey. And when I say Marcus Garvey, I want to make sure that I'm respectful. Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Amy Jacks Garvey, because the work of Marcus Messiah Garvey, we would know very little about had it not been for the ongoing publications and distribution of his works through Amy Ashwood Garvey, who took it international into the continent, Eurasia, etc., and Amy Jacks Garvey, his second beloved wife, who was able to keep this work going in Europe, in Canada, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, except Central and South America as well. And it's important that we look at that impact. And of course, the influence, as you said earlier, that Edward Wilmot Blyden's research, publications, and work had on great ones like George Padmore, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, in the case of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah being the first president of an independent Republic of Ghana. And that's a whole other piece, because you'll see the references in Nkrumah's work, from consignism to the world. And there's so much that is shared. We can look at The World in Africa by Dr. W.B. Du Bois, and you could tell the influence, the impact that Edward Wilmot Blyden had on him, even from the soul of Black folks in his early years, because there's a distinction of early Pan-Africanism in persons like Du Bois and what transpired in his later years, because he did live to be 90 plus. So he had time to go through different phases of Pan-Africanism. The other part that I'd like to share is that, like I've already mentioned, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro race, and that was published in the late 1880s. And it's important to know that while there are some more current editions, with the printing being a little bit easier for the reader, there's also pieces on Africa for the Africans. And it's important to know that that saying that we attribute to Garvey came through the work, effort, and utterances of Edward Wilmot Blyden. And some people don't know that. Yeah. And it's important. He influenced Hubert Harrison. He influenced so many great thinkers within the entire globe. It wasn't just like limited to the Caribbean and Liberia and Sierra Leone, like throughout the globe. I mean, there's another discourse that's very popular called The Elements of Permanent Influence. And I mention these because these were sermons that became more like speeches and writings and publications and teaching tools. And in his work, each of his speeches, sermons, publications, and teaching tools are useful for research and understanding the importance of the honorable, illustrious, I keep saying it, Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. And there are some others that came forward a little later. I mentioned African Life and Customs as well.
I will let you continue with any wrap up because we're coming to the end of our discussion. Again, to all our students and our educators and community members, we are talking about the life and works of the Honorable Reverend Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was born once more on August 3rd, 1832 in St. Thomas at what was then the Danish West Indies. Again, we have with us Dr. Chenzira Davis Kahina. She is the director of the Virgin Islands Caribbean Cultural Center. And we just want, as the director of the Division of Virgin Islands Cultural Education, for us to recognize the amount of scholars and intellectual persons and free-thinking persons, most of all, that have came out of the Virgin Islands, even the Danish West Indies, as it was formerly called. And we just want to raise up and give reverence to those persons. Dr. Chenzira?
I appreciate the opportunity to share reflections as we honor the 189th anniversary of the birth of the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. August 3rd is Edward Wilmot Blyden Day, and it is acknowledged as such in many parts of the world. And we are part of that here in the Virgin Islands, especially in the space of his birth. There are certain places that have been named after him. We have certain busts that have been prepared in his honor. One of the most recent busts that I'm familiar with was a hand-carved piece that was commissioned by Reverend Dr. Yvonne Washington Toure of God's House International. And it was made in Sierra Leone with the expressed intention of this bust of Edward Wilmot Blyden. It's a beautiful bust being placed here in the Virgin Islands. It has been gifted through former Senator Myron Jackson, and we're looking forward. We know that only because of recent public health protocols, things have been somewhat delayed, but we're looking forward to that actual unveiling of this wonderful artistic tribute honoring Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Perhaps that may be something that will be added to the 190th anniversary, if not sooner, next year in August. This morning, as I said as I close, I had the honor and privilege of having a call with a illustrious living treasure who is the great granddaughter of the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, and that's Isa Blyden. And I just want to share snippets of part of that conversation based on what she gave me permission to document and offer. I would like to share the fact that next year, 2022, will be the 190th anniversary of the birth of my great-grandfather, the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Many people still don't know who he is. And it is time we come to understand as Africans and descended Africans that the adjective Black does not identify the whole people. And when we use that term, it's intended to erase them. It is only a color. You only have an African racial identity, ethnic identity, Nigerian, Liberian, African, Caribbean, etc. A dark-skinned person cannot use the term Black and not limit their identification to them as Africans, African descendants, because it removes ourselves from that kind of identity. It removes us from the origins connected to the African ancestral lands. Civic education, and we're coming back to a time in our history that God has given us. Civic education allows for us to remember and honor our ancestors who left a blueprint for us, for our development, our advancement, for our self-realization. Again, we are a race of people with an identity, an African identity, African in the diaspora identity. We are no longer commodities. We are at a place where Africans are learning about ourselves, promoting ourselves, and using educational tools that are for, about, and by Africans, for Africans. And I paused there because Sister Queen Isa Blyden was kind enough to, she had a lot that she was going to say. And I said, next time we need to have you come in and share, that versation, because she's working very diligently to prepare for the events, the multiple activities that will be hosted in honor of the Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden for his 190th birth anniversary next August 3rd in 2022. And she has invited many different organizational entities to support this here in the Virgin Islands. And I'm sure with the right engagement and the proper fund development, that in addition to the VICCC at UBI engaging and other members within the government of the Virgin Islands, and of course, it would be very appropriate for the Division of Cultural Education in the Virgin Islands Department of Education under your directorship, Shalana Brown, to also share in that part, because there's so much that we get to put together. We'll have all the maps, we'll have all the photographs, and we can actually pull together a qualitative series of tributes. And that way we would leave from that experience having documentation, you know, videos, teachable materials, publications, articles, you know, art exhibitions, photographic exhibitions that truly hold up this great, illustrious historic icon, the Honorable Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, to the places that he should be held up to, because he is the great grandfather of Pan-Africanism, not just the father, but the great grandfather of Pan-Africanism and thought, liberty, and much, much more, because he lived what he spoke. And I'm very grateful to be able to share that with you and the students. Students, any questions? Bring them, VICCC at live.uvi.edu. Bring them to the Division of Cultural Education, because this is why we're here, to share information. Thank you very much.
I thank you once more. I appreciate your time so much. You have a blessed day. Thank you, students, teachers, and community members.